to worry about agency. So, in other words, after anti-Zionism, the new anti-Semitism won't just crop up, but somebody will create it. And so somebody will be out there and say, oh, look, here's a market I can fill, right? Oh, look, here's some conspiracy fantasy. Here's some people who feel that the world is all going wrong and that they've lost their place in it and they want to blame somebody. And they will be able to reach for the fragments of consciousness that create this particular feeling around the movement that they want to build. So it's about their power.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, and welcome to this edition of The Contrarian Podcast. I'm your host, David Bernstein. I'm delighted to be accompanied by my partner in this endeavor. That's Phil Siegel. And Phil and I have been interviewing a number of luminaries on what we've been calling the new anti-Zionism, scholars that have been trying to draw a line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism conceptually and also strategically. And we are really honored to have with us today someone who I regard really as like the preeminent scholar of contemporary anti-Semitism in the world, and that's David Hirsh. David is the head of the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and he is a professor of sociology, Goldsmiths, University of London, and an author and somebody who has written extensively about contemporary anti-Semitism and talks also about anti-Zionism and how it fits into the schema. And David, really appreciate you being on with us to help us think through these issues.
Hi, David. Pleasure to meet you. We've met a few times before, haven't we? Hi, Phil. It's a pleasure to meet you too.
Nice to meet you, David.
David, we've been taking stock of this new anti-Zionism. There's new scholarship and new scholars who seem to be emerging on the scene who are making arguments. People like Adam Lewis Klein, who wrote several months ago a piece in Tablet Magazine that got a lot of attention. And since then, there have been new efforts underway. Andrew Pessin, who we interviewed, is starting the Center for the Study of Anti-Zionism. Naya Lecht, who is somebody we're working with closely and has been starting her own institute and has a big conference coming up. And others have been really giving voice to this idea that we need to really look at anti-Zionism in its own right, distinct from anti-Semitism, even though I think they would all agree that it flows from anti-Semitism, but because it has its own distinct qualities, because the focus on anti-Semitism largely keeps the Jewish community fixated on a kind of traditional anti-Semitism that we see mostly from the political right. We're not focused properly on where the predominant threat emanates from, which they would argue comes from the far left. Help us understand what you're seeing, whether you think this is new, and whether you think they're onto something here.
So it's interesting because back in 2001, Phyllis Chesler, for example, wrote the book called The New Antisemitism. We were always a little bit skeptical about the name, the title. I mean, names and titles are always quite difficult because they're never quite right. We always thought that there was a lot that was old about the new anti-Semitism. And we also thought that there were many new anti-Semitisms, that each time a new kind of anti-Semitism comes along, then it is thought of as new. In fact, interestingly, each anti-Semitism, I believe, begins by disavowing the old. And this is standard. So we know that anti-Zionism does this. Anti-Zionism begins by disavowing what it calls anti-Semitism. and saying that no, anti-Zionism is a completely respectable new political engagement. And Wilhelm Marr, who is kind of popularly known to have coined the phrase anti-Semitism, also began by disavowing the history of, terrible and ridiculous Christian anti-Judaism, and saying that what we need now is a sort of proper modern scientific approach, and that old, prejudice of the Spanish Inquisition is contemptible. But it so happens that there is the quotes Jewish problem in our day, and we need a scientific analysis of it. So, firstly, everyone always begins by disavowing the old and saying that they're not in that tradition. And I think anti-Zionism does that. I think that anti-Zionism. So we began. I mean, on one level, it's a bit sort of academic-y and a bit ridiculous. This kind of discussion about the hyphens, but the hyphens illustrate something. And I think what they illustrate is, so it's an analogy with the word anti-Semitism, that scholars and activists began to lose the hyphen between anti and Semitism.
Right. Debler-Lipstadt, I think, pushed that very hard a decade or so ago.
Yeah, many of us did. And I suspect it's older than that. But there was a reason for that. There was something that we were trying to communicate with that, which was that there is no Semitism. There is no Semitism out there in the world that anti-Semites are critical of. And in fact, anti-Semitism constructs the Semitism or the Jews or the Jew of which it is critical. And so we just want to emphasize that point by losing the hyphen and losing the capital S for Semitism. So by analogy, really, it's become clearer and clearer that whereas there has been a kind of legitimate history of anti-Zionism as a movement which critiqued the idea of Zionism at one time. And it is kind of notionally possible that there could be a legitimate anti-Zionism, which is a critique of Zionism. But in reality, in our day, in our context, what anti-Zionism almost always does is it constructs a Zionism itself, which it then creates a worldview in opposition to. And I guess that's the key insight here, is that the Zionism of anti-Zionism is constructed by itself, and it shouldn't be confused with the Zionism that this or that Jewish person or organization embraces. Now, of course, and actually this goes back to a very key basic stuff about racism, right? That race itself does not exist in nature. Race is constructed by human beings taking particular characteristics of people which are in themselves trivial and upon which they endow huge explanatory power, right? So skin color or hair style or the shape of people's noses, whatever it may be. These are not sort of separate categories of human beings in nature. They are social habits that have been picked up, which endow huge power differences to people with these trivial innate characteristics. So race itself doesn't exist in the world. Now, of course, many people might kind of quite rightly say, look, Black people might say, I'm very proud of my Black heritage and my Black culture, and how dare you say I don't exist, right? That's not the point. That's not the point being made. If people are very proud of their culture, that's great. But racism doesn't allow people to define their own culture anyway. Racism, if you're walking down the street and you're Black and you get constructed as being Black by the people who are following you down the street, that is not a self-empowering and liberational identity. That is an identity that is thrust upon you. And by analogy, I think that's what happens to Jews, and it's also what happens to Zionists. So Zionists are not asked. So look, most Jews, nearly all Jews, have some kind of relationship to Israel, and it's not just chosen; it's a kind of constitutive part of their Jewish identity. It's not just voluntary. It's not just a politics which you choose to embrace or to not embrace. It's a part of you. It's a part of your family and your community and your history, and it's a part of who Jews are. But every Jew has a kind of unique relationship to Israel and to Zionism. What anti-Zionism does is it constructs one single Zionism, and it declares that all Jews, all Zionists, are that kind of Zionist. And what they mean by the word is racist. They mean Zionism is racism, Zionism is apartheid, colonialism, and in our day, above all, genocidal. So, you know, me and David, for example, we have slightly different understandings of our own relationships between us and the state of Israel. But that's not relevant to anti-Zionism, which would just construct us both against our will and without our consent and without discussing with us, would construct us both as racists and as enablers of genocide. So that's why we lose the hyphen, is to emphasize this idea that anti-Zionism freed itself from being an engagement with Israel. It's not a critical engagement. It is it constructs Israel as being essentially and inherently evil and symbolic of all evil in the world. And then it constructs a worldview around that symbolic evil. So the Nazis used to say that the Jews are the keys to history. If you don't understand the Jews, you don't understand anything, because the Jews are at the center of everything. The Jews are at the center of everything bad, every kind of unjust structure of power. If you dig behind it, you find the Jews. So the Jews are the keys to history. And anti-Zionism has a tendency to repeat precisely that pattern, that Zionism becomes the key symbolic way of thinking about the power that is said to lurk behind all of the institutions of human beings that we can see. So the people who think that the state and institutions and the press and parliament and law and human rights, people who think that it's all kind of fake, there's a temptation when you start with that kind of conspiracy fantasy to find a human face, which is the evil power behind all that fakery. And that's why anti-Semitism sells into that market so successfully. Whenever anybody starts with conspiracy fantasy, especially when the fantasy is of a big global conspiracy that screws us all, then anti-Semitism kind of perks up its marketing ears and says, oh, we can give you a face for that. We can give you a human person to focus on. Remember, in 1984, George Orwell's book, every day in every workplace, there's 2 minutes hate. And the 2 minutes hate is against Emmanuel Goldstein, who is the enemy of the people and the enemy of Big Brother. And he's this big Jewish face up on the screen. And because, of course, in the totalitarian state that Orwell, I want to say imagines, he didn't really imagine it, he observed it, in the totalitarian state, why isn't everything nice and perfect? Why doesn't Big Brother make, chocolate rations go up every day? Why isn't everything peaceful and beautiful? Oh, well, there has to be a reason, and the reason is the enemy of the people, and the enemy of the people is given a Jewish face.
Yeah. So that's great. That's really helpful. And I think you're of the guests that we've had on, you're the first person to fully articulate that so going to the to this new sort of crop of scholars that have emerged who are vigorously making the point that anti-Zionism is I think they would probably all agree with how you just spoke of it. Should the focus still be on treating anti-Zionism as just another expression of anti-Semitism, or should we start to develop a separate vocabulary of anti-Zionism and treat it as a distinct phenomena in at least how we talk about it publicly and how we challenge it in the public sphere?
So I think there's some confusion around this debate in the way that it has grown up. One of the parts of that confusion is simply that the word anti-Semitism means two quite different things. It means, in a technical sense, it means kind of the particular 19th century anti-Semitism that was sort of founded by Wilhelm Marr, which was largely a kind of, most of it was a sort of quite radical left liberal movement, actually, which at least thought it was interested in creating the democratic state and finding a place for Jews within it and the Jewish question and all that stuff, which kind of wanted to do some good but ended up doing a lot of bad. So that's one referent of the word anti-Semitism, is that particular 19th century movement. But the more normal, in England, they say the man on the Clapham omnibus, right? His understanding of the word anti-Semitism simply means sort of racism against Jews or discrimination against Jews or being arseholes about Jews. Excuse me, I don't know if there's this kind of podcast. And the reason I hesitate is because, of course, scholars have big arguments about whether anti-Semitism is a form of racism or not, or whether all of those things. But in normal parlance, we as Jewish communities and as people who are against anti-Semitism have been trying to win people over for 100 years to the idea that anti-Semitism is a bad thing and it is real and it exists and we should oppose it. And of course, with different amounts of success at different times. But I think that I am very reluctant to just let go of that work, and I'm very reluctant to say, well, okay, forget about that now. Now we're just going to talk about anti-Zionism. Because I ask the question, or anybody would ask me the question, why should I worry about anti-Zionism? And the reason they should worry about anti-Zionism is because it's anti-Semitic. It's anti-Semitic in the second sense, not in the technical, narrow sense of the particular movement that Wilhelm Marr created, but in the second sense of being, like racism against Jews. So, and actually, if it wasn't, if people said, well, why should I worry about it? So this part of the kind of political campaign is to delegitimize anti-Zionism itself without any reference to it being related to anti-Zionism, to anti-Semitism. And I think somebody might reasonably say, well, why should we delegitimize anti-Zionism? And I have a very clear answer to that. We delegitimize it because it is anti-Semitic, because it sits in a long line of different manifestations of what we might prefer to call anti-Judaism. Why do we want to delegitimize anti-Zionism? Because it's nearly always anti-Semitic. But if we lose that because, and we just say, well, anti-Zionism is wrong and stupid and aggressive against Israel, and aggressive against Jews. I mean, of course, if the ideology and the movement is aggressive against Jews all over the world, then of course it's anti-Semitic. So there is some confusion, I think, caused by the presence simply of these two different meanings of the word. It's quite interesting to me. I mean, I think of David Nuremberg, who wrote that fantastic book, sort of giving a 3,000-year history of, I think he calls it anti-Judaism, doesn't he? And he kind of shows how each is in so many ways so similar to each other. And he shows that it's a kind of 3,000-year history. But of course, the kind of more radical scholars, there is prick up, and they say, but we remember Hannah Arendt. Excuse me. And Hannah Arendt warns, don't do that. She says, of course, to Jews it's perfectly understandable if anti-Semitism looks like just more of, old wine in new bottles, more of the same thing. She says it's perfectly understandable, but we need to be really accurate and careful to look at each new manifestation of anti-Semitism as something specific. They occur in very, very different times and places, right? The Roman Empire or medieval England or 19th century Syria or 20th century Berlin or Moscow or 21st century Pakistan or New York are all very, very different times and places. So Arendt says anti-Semitism isn't just a kind of magic thing in the air. If it's 3,000 years old, there's not a lot we can do about it, right? If it's 3,000 years old, then it looks like it's just a fact of human history that we have to just learn to kind of deal with. But in fact, each anti-Semitism is not just out there in the ether, it's constructed by people who use it. So actually, there was a nice study, I think, from Germany, in which somebody did a correlation of places where anti-Semitism was big in medieval times and compared it to places where Nazism was strong in the 20th century, and found that the same places were sort of prone to anti-Semitism, and that's controlling for the obvious things like class and economic wealth, and controlling for everything that you might think is important. It was still said that these places were anti-Semitic. Now, it's a really interesting finding, actually, and I don't entirely know how to explain it, but one of the things I would like, and my colleague Dave Rich at the CST explained it by saying that the landscape is shaped, and when the rain comes, when crisis comes, the same shapes in the rock collect the same anti-Semitic water, the same anti-Semitism. But I also want to think very carefully about agency, because I think that one of the things we lose with this sort of ahistorical notion of anti-Semitism, or the notion of reservoirs, or the notion of puddles of collecting in the same places, one of the things we lose is agency. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, of course, each anti-Semitism looks similar. Why? Because these fragments of tropes and ideas and notions and images, they all kind of lie around in the culture. And this is quite a subtle point as well, because where do they lie around? Where are they in the unconscious? I don't know. I mean, look, I think I think in the Britain I grew up in, I think also the America you grew up in, I don't think there was very much anti-Semitism, right? We were coming to the end of a kind of xenophobic, we don't want Jews in our golf club or in our university because they're sort of foreigners with big noses, and we don't want to get changed with them. That was coming to an end, and people seem to have understood from the Holocaust that anti-Semitism was a terrible thing. And in the sort of 1970s, 80s, 90s, anti-Semitism was really very much a weird minority issue. So where were all these tropes hiding, right? Because now the tropes are all rediscovered in anti-Zionism, right? The idea that the caricatures, actually, Jews with big noses and ugly faces, and Jews as blood-sucking, and Jews as child murderers, and Jews as people who control minds, and who control Hollywood, and who control the banks, and who use their power to subvert governments. All of those sort of fragments seem to be alive and well in the cultural unconscious, even though we weren't very conscious of them at all. When Woody Allen was quite happy, sort of really taking the piss out of Jews and out of himself and kind of creating these like rather wonderful Jewish characters, the kind of Nebuchadnezzar Jew. But the interesting thing about that is he was not afraid to do that. You could do that in New York in the 1970s, and everyone understood
because we weren't vulnerable.
Yes.
We weren't vulnerable, so you could project vulnerability.
Yes, that's right.
Seinfeld, Larry David, Woody Allen, all that whole class.
Yeah.
So
that needs to be that's an idea that, by the way, I think that, and maybe David, you're aware of this, but I think that could be fleshed out a little bit, because I don't think we have that luxury anymore to sort of wallow in our victimization or in that weak Jew imagery anymore, because I think it's now coming back to haunt us, and I think we'd be much better off and more secure if we wallowed in our strength than in our victimhood. If we projected a different image now, don't mess with us, as Brett Stevens said in a recent talk.
That's a really interesting question, because of course that's also the image of Jews that anti-Zionist Jews love. That the anti-Zionist Jews love the image of the kind of the sort of powerless Jew, the clever Jew, the funny Jew, the Jew who's good at jazz and who hangs out with black people in jazz clubs, and they have this fantasy of the kind of Yiddish speaking Jew, because they have a fantasy of themselves as being, part of the community of the good and part of the community of the oppressed.
Right. They want to go to the books. They want to go to some cafe in like early 20th century Europe and sit down with their friends and talk about socialism and how it's going to eventually. That's what they fantasize themselves as being.
Right, but they need to be very clear-eyed about where those cafes went. And where
they forget that part.
Went.
That part's
because it's all gone.
It's too inconvenient. Right.
Yeah.
So I have so many questions for you, David, but I want to push on one, because as David Bernstein knows, I'm very obsessed about what's going to happen over the next 25 to 30 years, whether we're all here or not. But, the thing that fascinated me with what you were just talking about is kind of combining your comment about the past and then Hannah Arendt's observation about it. What if we solved the anti-Zionism problem like we did? We solved the anti-Semitism problem by having essentially half of us have to be killed, right? And that caused the world to kind of realize they woke up from their stupor and realized that at that time contemporary anti-Semitism was no longer acceptable. Hopefully that isn't what it takes to solve the anti-Zionism problems. Hopefully we can make reasonable arguments or other convincing, but whatever it takes. But the point is, something else is going to then crop up. And so how do we, as Wayne Gretzky talked about, skating ahead to the puck, how do we try to figure out what that's going to be if we solve this problem of anti-Zionism?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because how do we, the people who will be, in this hypothetical, right? Like, don't leap ahead of having defeated anti-Zionism, because I think anti-Zionism is very powerful. I think anti-Zionism is extremely mainstream. I don't know if you know these guys, like in England, there's this sort of Gary Lineker is the sort of famous and hugely loved footballer, and Dawn French is this sort of very mainstream comic comedian, and both of them, got into quotes trouble saying anti-Zionist things. And if those two are doing it, then everybody's doing it, right? So anyway, to skip over having dealt with that, I would love to be able to do that and then worry about this problem. But this problem, this is another problem, right? Because what I said was, I think we need to worry about agency. So, in other words, after anti-Zionism, the new anti-Semitism won't just crop up, but somebody will create it. And so somebody will be out there and say, oh, look, here's a market I can fill, right? Oh, look, here's some conspiracy fantasy. Here's some people in a, who feel that the world is all going wrong and that they've lost their place in it and they want to blame somebody. And they will be able to reach for the fragments of consciousness that create this particular feeling around the movement that they want to build. So it's about their power. Some hypothetical person in the future will say, I want to bolster my power. I want to get my message across. Let me give you an example. During the boycott campaign in the early 2000s, there was an image that really interested me. It was an image of a Jaffa orange with blood coming out of it. And it said, don't by apartheid or something like that. And I looked at that image and I thought it was just so obviously a blood libel image. It was so clearly an image that said, don't give your children this orange to eat because the Jews have filled it with the blood of non-Jews, and that's why you shouldn't eat it. Now, I don't think it's plausible that the person who designed that poster knew that. I don't think it's plausible that they said to themselves, oh, let's do a blood libel image. But I think what they did do was they said, this will work. You know, you imagine they had a whole load of sketches on their easel and they said, this one will work. And I think that's how the kind of, if it's like a market, that's how anti-Semitic images and tropes kind of rise to the top. There's a demand for them, and nobody quite knows why it works, but I suspect we know why it works.
But that image, but going back to your earlier statement, that somehow resides in the subconscious of some segment of our society where they can draw on that imagery and not even know that that's what they're drawing on. You know, it is a mystery. I mean, as someone who, like you, deals with anti-Semitism and thinks about and writes about it all the time, I still don't understand quite how that works, like where these subconscious templates lie in our collective memory and why they're so easy to resurrect in these situations. It's still bizarre to me at some level.
It is bizarre, and I don't know exactly. Like, look, you have to have some notion of the collective unconscious or the social unconscious, but I don't know how to exactly do that. But what we do know is that when look, there are conflicts all over the world. There have been conflicts all over the world, for example, since 1945. And in all of those conflicts, there are child soldiers and there are child victims, and people under the age of 18 die. But we know, but we know that the allegation against Israel of child murder really works. People believe it. They like it. They. Let me give you another example. There was an MP called Jenny Tong, and she was known for being embracing a lot of the more foolish anti-Zionist tropes. This is a little while ago. And do you remember there was an earthquake in Haiti, and the Israelis sent some teams to go and help with rescue? And then there was this story arose in Haiti that the Israelis were really there to harvest body parts, to take body parts back wherever to Israel and to sell kidneys and hearts and whatever on the open market. So the Jewish Chronicle they must have been a bit bored that day. So they phoned up Jenny Tong and said, there's been an allegation made against the Israeli rescuers that they are selling body parts. Should this be investigated? And she just said, yeah, sure. Of course, there's an allegation. It should be investigated. And she didn't stop and think, is this in fact at all plausible? Is there any chance that this is true? Does it make any sense? No, she just lives in a world where it's completely plausible to believe that it could be happening, that the IDF goes to Haiti in order to harvest body parts.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me. I like your comment on collective unconscious, where it takes some agitate. Think of it like bleach that's stuck in a shirt or something like that. In a way, it just needs to be agitated in the washing machine or something. And you kind of look today at the Jeremy Corbyns where you are, and unfortunately the people like Chris Van Hollen and Ro Khanna in the United States, where it doesn't always take a Zoran Mamdani, who very clearly and almost most people see that as problematic. But, those others are politicians that are pretty mainstream in the United States, and Corbyn has become a little more mainstream, I guess, in Britain. And it just takes them to agitate a little bit, and all this stuff starts to shake loose again. And I think that's part of your point, right? Is, at some point, somebody will create something new that agitates and shakes those things loose again.
I mean, I don't know, in Europe, there was, terrible repression of all kinds of people, right? Of Protestants and Huguenots and the Amish. I don't know. If somebody wants to reach into the past for images and finds images that were used against the Huguenots in France and they all had to flee for fear of their lives, I suspect that just won't resonate, right? We don't know what they are. We don't know what was said about the Huguenots. But if they reach in the past for things that were said about Jews, it resonates. And it's a problem kind of analytically because people often try to sort of say, well, why? How does the left embrace anti-Semitism, or how does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitic? And in the end, you can only explain it by the preponderance of anti-Semitism that is already there. So it's easy to say, well, people have this Manichaean view of the world and they divide the world into North and South and white and black and oppressor and oppressed, and they replace every possible left and liberal value with one absolute value of anti-colonialism, right? That's fine, that makes sense. But you then still need a further step in the argument to say why that anti-colonialism is so beautifully symbolized by Zionism.
Yeah, although there are two theories I've heard recently. One was Adam Kirsch in his book Settler Colonialism. He says, well, that's because this form of anti-colonialism and anti-Zionism has a chance of succeeding. In other words, the Americans killed off all the indigenous people. They're weak populations. They have no chance of succeeding, but they're still holding out some hope that Palestinians can realize their anti-colonialist fantasies. And then Alana Newhouse recently in her much talked about piece in Tablet magazine argues that it really that anti-Zion that Israel itself goes against the grain of the sort of apologetic postmodern world where we're supposed to post-national world. In other words, we're supposed to have given up on our national ideals. We're supposed to now engage in this universalistic fantasy, and Israel is a counterpoint to that and therefore must be killed off because it's a successful society, precisely because it hasn't given up on its national ideals. Those are two things that I've heard that exacerbate this sort of anti-Zionist fervor that we're experiencing.
And it turns out the only non-ethno states are Western democracies, and that definitely causes dissonance in people's minds.
Well, so on the first one, Adam Kirsch's brilliant book, of course, a lot of the boycotters always wanted to say, like, you would say, you want to boycott Israel, only Israel. Why do you only pick on Israel? Of course, that's going to have consequences in terms of the way people think about Jews if you do that. And the answer sometimes would be, well, no, Israel's not the worst. In fact, Israel's one of the best. Israel has a chance of changing, so we should put pressure on Israel because it could change, or because the Palestinians could win, or some such kind of, it's a really nonsense defense of singling out Israel. And the second one, I think, is also interesting.
I don't know that he would call it a defense, by the way. I think he would say it's sort of, I think he would also say that that's subconscious. In other words, their appetite is whet because they think that they could win. I don't think they would make that into an actual argument.
Well, I've heard that used when you say, why do you pick on Israel to boycott? I mean,
maybe there are people who say that.
Did you see Ben and Jerry? Ben and Jerry actually called Ben and Jerry, these two old guys, they're boycotting Israel, and somebody said, well, you don't like what happens in Texas, why don't you boycott that? And the guy was just speechless, and he didn't know, and he couldn't answer it, right? He just stood there as though he had just realized he was an idiot.
He hasn't thought about anything but besides ice cream his whole life. Right. He hasn't thought about anything besides ice cream his whole life and whatever popular whatever.
Well, ice cream and so A, ice cream, but B, keeping his ice cream in the community of the good, right?
Right, exactly.
And you can't keep your ice cream in the community of the good if you sell in Israel. But of course, they do sell in Israel, right? You buy Ben and Jerry's all over Israel. So presumably there's some franchising deal or something. So it's all. Poof. What the second point? Remind me what the second point was because it was interesting about.
Alana Newhouse's point about
Yes, I remember. Sorry. So I think that's interesting, and we might disagree on that because I think that it's interesting. I had a really good friend and colleague in through the Brexit debate in Britain, and he was one of the few people on the left who supported Brexit, and he said it's very strange. My Jewish friends they don't accept a sort of cosmopolitan multinational citizenship for themselves, for Israel, but they accept it for my people, for the Brits. And why is that? And actually, I found that quite an unpleasant point to be making because I don't think Israelis choose it. I think it's forced upon them. I think Israelis were forced back into, what Isaac Deutscher called the Life-Raft state. And why does Israel have to play football in Europe? Because no one in Asia will play with them, right? Why does Israel have to, if you offered the Israelis the political settlement of the European Union, right, where borders could come down, everybody would be nice to each other, there would be peace across the borders, you could trade, you could, go to Damascus for lunch. If that was on offer, the Israelis would grab it. But the problem is, it's not on offer. The problem is, if you go to Damascus for lunch, they will kill you.
Yeah. I mean, it's like Sartre said in The Anti-Semite and the Jew, the anti-Semite creates the Jew, maybe the anti-Zionist creates the Israeli. But the Israeli, it's hard, and those are hard things to untangle because we don't know the answer to what degree Israeli identity now, even if it were freed from its security needs would. I think Tel Aviv and Jerusalem have always been two sides of that same coin, whereas the Tel Aviv is precisely about that quest for normalization, and Jerusalem is precisely about that quest for particularism and the desire to be us no matter what the anti-Semites say. And so I think you'd have both of those in the Israeli or Jewish body politic. But it isn't. By the way, I think the challenge that your friend posed is real, and you could argue that after Alana's piece, I started to ask myself, well, maybe Brexit was a good idea for precisely that reason.
So the argument there would be that it's not on offer to the Brits either. It only appears to be on offer, and it's not really on offer.
That's really an interesting point.
But you talk about Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Look at Paris and Berlin. I mean, they were killing each other, or one was killing the other for the most of the 20th century, right? But when you then create a peace, and you create democratic structures, and you create democratic structures between states, then it's astonishing. Give it 40, 50 years, and you bring down the border. I mean, it just came down. Look at the German populations that were moved out of Gdansk and out of places in Czechoslovakia. Everyone has the right to move and live wherever they want now, and it's not a problem.
But Alana would argue that it is a problem. Alana would say that thrust toward this kind of universalism and borderless states is actually creating a kind of misery in and of itself. In other words, it's sort of liberalism taken too far to the point where it doesn't have any cultural and moral and spiritual backbone anymore. And so therefore can't actually meet human needs in a real way. And it makes it so Europeans become intellectually lazy about the threat of Muslim immigration, for example.
Yeah, because you have to have something that ties the country's identity together, whether it's an ethno identity or something, right? And there are countries that are throwing that away. And
it's destroying them. It's destroying them, she would argue.
And it's destroying them because there is no identity anymore. What Canada decided they wanted. Yeah.
Of course, people make this idea about this. People make similar arguments about the United States of America, whose ethnic identity is precisely cosmopolitanism. And incidentally, it's not accidental, therefore, why anti-Americanism takes on very similar shapes to anti-Semitism. The ways in which people are scathing of America, they have no real connection to any piece of earth. They have no real community. They have no real culture. They only care about money. They're spread all over the world. They all of that stuff is both the shape of anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And look, I mean, there are people like Jonathan Rauch, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He writes a lot about liberalism, and he argues that actually American liberalism needs Christianity, needs a robust Christianity, not a xenophobic Christianity, not an angry Christianity, but and he's an atheist, by the way. He calls himself an atheist homosexual Jew, but still argues that we need this, and so American identity is not just cosmopolitanism. It turns out that it's actually a combination of cosmopolitanism, or I would call it liberalism, and some notion of like Judeo-Christian morality and culture, and so are European countries in their own right, and need more of that than they like to admit in today's world. But I'm glad we had this conversation, because we're bringing together different threads that I've been thinking a lot about.
We're moving off the topic, which could be really interesting, but actually you brought it back perhaps to the topic by talking about Judeo-Christian culture, because of course Jews in Europe might be kind of astonished to learn that they live in a Judeo-Christian culture, given that Christian culture was in many ways and significantly embedded in a sort of opposition to Judaism. That anti-Semitism,
more so than in the U.S.
Yeah, I'm a bit skeptical about that idea of Judeo-Christian culture from the point of view of the Jews, and also actually from the point of view of people who are neither. But anyway, we should have that discussion also about nationalism.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I'd love to do that. What can I just? So the question, one last question that's just on my mind, and we have to wrap this up. Is can the new anti-Zionists succeed in getting people to view anti-Zionism as its own form of bigotry? I mean, is it a successful political enterprise in your view?
I think there are problems with it. I think one problem is, for example, I've been a number of times an expert witness in a court case, and interestingly, people kind of forget that anti-Semitism is not a crime, but there are crimes that require you to demonstrate anti-Semitism, and then certain other things follow. So if I go to court and they say, tell me why this set of facts was anti-Semitic, I can tell them. And this set of facts is an anti-Zionist set of facts, right? So the court says to me, why is this anti-Semitic? And I will tell them, and they will generally disregard it and not understand it and not go with it, right? So, but it wouldn't help. It wouldn't make it easier for me to say, well, don't worry about whether it's anti-Semitic or not, because it's bad in itself. And the court would say, well, yeah, but this case is about anti-Semitism, is about discrimination against Jews in one form or another, and you have to prove that this is discrimination against Jews. So, in other words, if we can't win the argument in particular cases that anti-Zionism had anti-Semitic effects or causes, then it's even harder to just prohibit anti-Zionism altogether without going through that step. And if we can't win that step, which we have great trouble doing, then we can't. And then, I mean, I've had discussions actually with Andrew Pessin, and he sort of said, well, if we can't do that, let's try this. And I said to him, I mean, it was a bit off the cuff, but I said, you know, if we're in a car that's driving towards the cliff edge and we're trying to put the brakes on, we're sort of madly hitting the brakes and the brakes are not working. And Andrew's sitting next to me and says, well, let's try putting on the radio. like, we need to make the brakes work. We can't just say, well, the brakes don't work, so let's try something else. And we can't just say persuading people that anti-Zionism, or persuading people that this or that manifestation of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic is hard, and we can't always succeed in doing it, so we won't bother to do it. We'll just say that anti-Zionism is bad anyway.
Yeah.
And I think the road that can take us down is a road which just then says, actually, we're going to, anti-Zionism seems to have been so successful, let's try doing what they do. And of course, the reason anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, one of the reasons is because it defines Jews, be it against their will and without their consent, as genocidal, as like Nazis. And what follows from that is that Jews then get pushed out of any space that they live in, right? Out of the arts where they work, or the medicine where they work, or the law where they work, or the sociology department where they work. Sorry, I've lost my thread a little bit. That I was obviously, in my view, so
what makes anti-Zionism successful, and why is it so hard for us to replicate that in the anti-Zionism?
So anti-Zionism constructs the field of the community of the good, right? And it constructs, you know, nearly all Jews, unless they disavow using the particular words required, it constructs them as being outside, pushes them outside of the community of the good and the community of rational discourse. We don't have to discuss with you. We don't have to listen to your experience or your evidence, because we know what you're really up to. And we're just going to push you out because you're an enemy. So that's how anti-Zionism works. And I think that perhaps there's a temptation in the anti-Zionism world to try to repeat that, to try to say, well, it's anti-Zionism that is a violation of, it's anti-Zionism that is Nazi, not us. They're the Nazis.
That's exactly right.
And we should treat everyone who is anti-Zionist as being outside of the community of rational discourse. And I'm not completely unsympathetic to that, but I do not think that we should embrace the methods of anti-Zionism. And also, I don't think we can, because the methods of anti-Zionism are a method of power, and we don't have power.
The other writers and thinkers on this subject is, look, we are, 13 million people worldwide. You know, there are 50 members of the Islamic Conference in the UN. There are 22 Arab states. There are an extensive network of NGOs that are sort of, arrayed against us. And that collective power, the power of numbers, can set terms that we punch above our weight, but we don't punch above our weight to the degree that we can overcome those odds. That's sort of my fear of all this, is that it overestimates our own power to set terms.
There's a nice, yes, and in that sense, it kind of it buys into the myth of Jewish power. Actually, I mean, I remember I was at an event in America recently, and a woman who had a very lovely old Israeli accent, and she sort of said, "Oh, Hasbara is so terrible. You know, why can't we do better?" And my answer was, well, why on earth would you think that 13 million Jews would be able to win over the whole world if it's hostile? Why would you think that? And she did think that. She thought, if only we could do it better, then we wouldn't be in this mess. And the analogy, a nice analogy actually, is Holocaust denial, right? So everybody knows that Deborah Lipstadt and others and everybody, Jewish communities, refused to debate Holocaust deniers. And instead they just said, no, Holocaust denial is anti-Semitism because it's conspiracy fantasy and because it carries on the crime of the Shoah itself. And it should not have a place within the community of the good and within the community of democratic politics. And we will not debate it. and that was the right strategy. But it's not a sort of timeless principle. It was only the right strategy because we could keep it out of the community of democratic politics. If lots and lots of people became convinced of Holocaust denial in its classic sense, then there would come a time when we would have to lay out the evidence that the Holocaust happened, and we might even have to debate with these people. Because, so my point is that when
Because it's
we
the
have
best
the
we can
power,
do. Because it's the
Yeah,
best we
when we
can
have
do
the
in that
power-
context.
when we
I'm
have
not
the power
agreeing with
to
you guys
do
on
it-
this.
I know.
when we have
Phil and
the-
I are going to have this debate at one point or another because Phil thinks that we have more power than we actually than that. He thinks
I just
that,
think there's fewer of them than we think there are. That there are lots of people who are neutral, that are useful idiots, that have picked
Yes.
this up. That I think the enemy is smaller than we think
Phil,
it is.
I completely agree with that in two senses, actually. One is, like, if you look at the polling, and this polling is a few years old, so it might be worse than that now, but I saw polling which said about 25% of people in Britain embrace opinions which I think are anti-Semitic, and about 25% of people in Britain were very friendly towards Israel and Jews. And the middle 50% was kind of don't know, don't care. By the way, I'm really in favor of don't know, don't care. I wish more people would not know
Right.
and not
Yeah,
care.
we need
Right.
more of them.
Yes,
you might be. You could then go do regular
Well-
sociology like a proper British sociologist.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
yes.
and then because ask your friends every now and then, why do you think you know so much about Israel?
That's right. Or ask people what they think about how it turned out with the ethnic cleansing of the Tamils in Sri Lanka. And they'll
Exactly, and you get a blank look. Yeah, exactly.
They go, I don't know.
Even Darfur. Even
Yeah.
Darfur. Very few people know about that.
Yeah. So,
anyway.
so actually, in that sense, if the world didn't know, didn't care, then I suspect that the little local conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians would have been settled decades ago, right? But it's a kind of cultural appropriation that the Israelis and the Palestinians get made into the kind of passion play of the whole world, and not that it's it's kind of a single passion play.
Yeah, the Franz Fanon fantasy, right? They become the Franz Fanon fantasy. Yeah.
Well, incidentally, Fanon was interesting. Fanon was much smarter than some of what he wrote, actually, but as was Foucault. But their followers are much less smart than they were. But I wanted to make the other point about Phil. Firstly, what was it? The Jews are not powerless. Firstly, because there are lots of friends, and by the way, not all of those friends are really our friends, or not all of those friends are people we want to be friends with. Isabella Tabarovsky said, "Well, we've been jilted by the community that we love. Why don't we go and date elsewhere with people who love us?" And I kind of said, "But we don't really want to." And she said, "Well, we're not going to marry them; just date them." But I'm groping to one other point. Yes, the other sense in which we are not as powerless as people sometimes present is you sometimes get people who explain this topic and they begin by saying Jewish people, and they begin by saying our enemies are hugely powerful and hugely well organized, and they're so cunning and they're so brilliant, and the Muslim Brotherhood has had this campaign for 50 years, and look how they've succeeded. And I don't really buy that view of the world. I think that people on the anti-Zionist side hate each other just as much as we do, just as much as Jews hate each other, and probably more so. Having come out of the far left, I'm very aware of how there is not this kind of cunning and brilliant conspiracy to overcome liberal democracy. I mean, it's true that they kind of would like to, but the reality of how that's happened is much more organic and actually much more difficult. If it was just a conspiracy, it would be easier. We just stop Qatari money or whatever. But it's not that easy. And it doesn't matter how much money you put into American universities, if there is no appetite, if there is no market for anti-Semitism, it doesn't matter. You could spend the the whole oil revenue of Qatar. But if there is no appetite, if people are not excited by anti-Semitism, it wouldn't be successful. And so some of that, so we shouldn't overestimate the power of anti-Zionism in that sense, in the sense of it being a kind of brilliant and cunning conspiracy. But then, as I say, in a way, it's worse. In a way, it's a much more organic kind of movement of understanding the world.
Yeah, this is great, and it was very different than the previous conversations because it sort of, it sort of took on a larger intellectual frame, which I think we're going to need to make sense of this new movement and the world itself. So, David, thank you so much for your wisdom. We may tap it again at some point in the not too distant future, and I'm so glad that you're one of the people that's helping us make sense of contemporary anti-Semitism. I think you've got a great wisdom to draw on. So thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thanks so much, David. Thanks, Phil.
So, Phil, that was an interesting discussion with David Hirsh. Very different than the others. It was it sort of climbed the ladder of abstraction, as a professor of mine used to say, and gave us some larger context for it. And I think you and I are going to have it out on whether or not we can set the terms of debate, about whether the other side is small or big. I actually think you're wrong about that to a degree. I think the other side is small in terms of its percentage of the hardcore believers in American society are actually quite small, but it has a very long tail. In other words, it's not just those people that set the debate. It's also the fact that all these people around the world don't like us, including large segments of the Arab and Muslim world, and that they can constantly push this back into the discourse, even if we're able to put up a good fight.
Well, we'll have to argue that separately, but just on the call today, or on the podcast today, the thing that was most interesting and very heartening for this older guy is seeing how kind of the ones that have been around maybe a little bit longer can set a context that maybe, the upstarts who have incredibly good ideas, but maybe don't have the same context that some of the people that have been doing it a long time. I wrote down tons of different things that he talked about, the collective unconscious, the whole filling a market need as being kind of the standard. And, he put more context than the others did around the disavowal of the old methods, right? That each time, when it's clear that, for example, the old, Nazi anti-Semitism wasn't going to work anymore because of the absolute, disgusting, outcome of the Holocaust, that they were able to disavow, came up with a new construct and disavowed it. So it isn't just moving through time one way, one different way, but it's also this disavowal and then making it match the current, state of play in human, kind of human belief. That's important to set it up.
In defense of Naya, she does argue that. She does try to place anti-Zionism in this larger, and she says that anti-Zionism taps into whatever a country or a people feels is important at the time, and or threatening them at the time, and Jews fill that vacuum. So she does do that here, and so I think it's a very interesting question as to whether or not. Like David is a little skeptical about whether or not you can tell he's torn on this. Like I was asking him as point blank as I could, is this a good idea, David? Can we do it? And is it a good idea? And I thought he hedged on both of those questions.
He did.
Like I don't think he said this is a good or bad idea. I think he's really caught in between sort of Adam Fuller, who was the academic I interviewed about guns, but we also talked a little bit about this the new anti-Zionism, and who said, look, I don't think it can, I don't think it's going to work at all. And I think it actually plays to the favor of the anti-Zionists. I think he's worried about that. But I think I think he's also partially persuaded that it might be worth, as he put it, driving up into we're about to drive over a cliff and turn on the radio. I think he's willing to entertain the possibility. Maybe just go ahead and turn on the radio because
the outcome of not to scare everybody is unthinkable, right? Because the first round, we had a mass casualty event in the Spanish Inquisition. The second, we had a mass casualty event in the Holocaust. Is the only way, to cleanse, this version of it is to have another mass casualty event and then move on from there. That's, it's unthinkable, right? And we have to try to avoid that in, whatever we have. And kind of saying that it isn't solvable is a little bit scary when you think about what the outcomes have been the first two rounds.
Right. I think that's right. And I think, it reminds me that we just wrote that piece that was on the cover of the Jewish Journal. And, and our thesis was, we can still write the rest of the story of the Jewish people. Now, honestly, I'm not sure that's correct. Okay. I'm not sure that's correct. Because I think there may be forces that are greater than any of us.
Sure.
And that said, I know what's not going to work. I know just being fatalistic about these forces and acting and
work.
Not doing anything, doing a different. I know how that story ends. I don't know how the story of us acting with great agency and greater strategic clarity ends, because it may work or it may partially work and steer us in a better direction. I'd rather err on the side of agency than fatalism. That's just me, though.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great. To be continued.